I'm weaving with TempoTreadle on the spring loom, it remembers where I left off. So I'll press treadle 1. And right now I have the OK beeps turned on. I can turn those off or make them quieter. And what it's doing is every time that it senses that the right treadle was depressed, it gives me the OK beep. And I don't have to look at the screen if I pretty much know my pattern. I'm going to demonstrate making a mistake here. So right now, I'm going to press treadle 9. Now you immediately heard the error beep, and so I press 9 is calling for 5. So all I have to do is go back and do the right treadle and keep going. So I know the screen's a little hard to see here, so I'll show you some of the features a little more up close on the screen. I've disconnected the TempoTreadle system unit from the sensor array on my loom, and I've moved it to a dark room, so hopefully you can better see the screen. And I'd like to go through most of the features on TempoTreadle to show you how they work. So there is a micro SD card that gets slid up under this light here into that slot, and you saved my WIF file, my weaving design from my computer or Mac onto that card and place it in the system unit. Once that card is in the unit and you've loaded your project, you typically don't need your PC anymore. All of your progress and that design is saved inside the TempoTreadle system unit. So right now this is a real active project that I have on my loom, and I'm going to show you a few things about it. So first of all, this is what's called the home screen, and you can, if you're on another screen, you can always get back by pressing the little house icon. Will return you to home. You'll spend most of your life in the weave screen. That is a screensaver if you ever see that pop up. The weave screen looks like this, and I want to show you what that means. If you'll notice, there are 3 lines there: 308, 309, and 310. 309 has a little box around it. That is what we call the current pick. So if I was at my loom, I would know I should press treadle 5 and throw a purple weft pick. And I can tell that my next pick after 5 will be 6, and I can tell that my prior pick was 8. These green arrows at the side are not normally used, but you can scroll up and down if you want to reposition or see where you are, although I do caution you that you can reset your place, and that's just know what you're doing if you do that. So normally you never have to use the green arrows, and I seldom touch them. When I press treadle 5, it'll automatically advance up, and treadle 6 will be in the middle at sequence 310, so it just keeps progressing up through my design as I whiff automatically. But you can, like if I press the up arrow here, I'll go back, and then if I press the down one, if you press hard, it'll go fast. Well, not hard, but just firmly, and leave your finger there. So I better, since this is a real project, I sure don't want it to reset my place. So I'm going back to 309, and it will save where it is. There's a little, I call it a button, but it's a place on the screen. Notice the blue that says weave. This means you're weaving through your pattern. If you press this and it goes to unweave, that means that next time when I press treadle 8, it'll go backwards in the sequence. So then it'll call for treadle 7 next. So in the rare event with TempoTreadle, when you do need to unweave, like maybe you had a bubble in a weft pick or something like that, you can use the unweave program feature of the weave program. Just remember to always put it back to weave before you continue on. On this screen in the lower left hand corner, it's a little bit small for you to see in this video, but there's a pick 1 and a pick 2. Those are 2 pick counters that show, and I'm seeing 982 for both values because I haven't reset them to do anything different. So they're just sequentially counting every time I register a good pick as I am weaving. And I'll show you why that's useful in a bit. So now let's go back to the home screen and let's look at project setup. I'm going to show just a couple of things about loom action. If you have one loom for TempoTreadle, this will be set up for you when you receive the unit, and you may never go in here. But there is for floor looms, there are two actions that you may use. One's called single, and if you have a counter marsh or a parallel counter marsh, that's probably the only one you will ever use. It's important that the position is up for most looms. If you have a loom where it is supposed to be down, we will certainly set that originally for you and put that in the setup information for your loom. Single, table, table 2, and multiple are the choices you have for action. So I'll explain a little bit about the differences. On a jack loom, you may have a weaving design where you're using a skeleton tie-up or whatever, and you're pressing more than one treadle at a time. You must use multiple if that's going on. There is another situation on a jack loom. If you have a tie-up such that another treadle other than the one you pressed is going down because it was tied to a subset of shafts that another treadle is invoking, two treadles will be being sent, so it's important that you have it in multiple mode if that's the case. But even with a jack loom with a lot of tie-ups, only one treadle is going to go down at a time. And if that's the case, you can put it on single, and you may say, well, why wouldn't I always leave it on multiple? You certainly can, and I usually do. But the difference in single and multiple is, if you have an aerotone, it will sound immediately as soon as that treadle is detected, and hopefully before you've had a chance to throw your weft through that shed. In multiple, if you make an error, most of the time you will actually throw the pick, the bad pick, and then your shed goes to neutral, and it gets the aerotone at that point in time, and you actually have to back out that one pick. And that's certainly better than backing out a lot of them, but if you can use single, it'll give you the error alert sooner. Okay, I'm going back to the home screen. I'm going to go back into project setup. So we looked at loom action, and now let's look at load width. So load width is something you do when you're first setting up a project, and usually I do it once and then I'm on Autoload and I never have to go to the screen again. But let me show you some things about this. Now in this case, I've got several different projects on this card. Eventually I'll delete some of these projects off the card just because they're sorted alphabetically and I really just don't want to have to scroll through extra things. But find the one you want just by selecting on the screen, and notice I selected Burnick.width, and I now have a green load button beside it. There's also something called quick load down here, and it's set to yes. It will be set to yes after you have loaded it once. The very first load is slow, and the reason why it's slow is we're building something called a cache file that's stored on your micro SD card that makes it more efficient for TempoTreadle to do all the things it's doing while you're weaving. So the only reason why you ever need to know about quick load is if you say on Burnick I started weaving for a few inches and I decided I wanted to change some of my weft colors or something like that. I might want to go back to my computer, change my weft, put it back on the card, and reload it. So if you ever need to reload it for changes, just press that yes and it'll turn to a no, and that way it will do a slow load. And if it's a big weft with 500, 1,000 warp threads, weft threads, lots of colors, it can easily take some time. It might take 5, 10, even 20 minutes or so. But once the cache is built and you power on each subsequent time, it's always pretty quick. So I'm going to change this back to quick load. Whoops, hit the camera. And while we're on the screen, I will mention copy Treadle Settings very briefly. If you're new to this, this may be more information that you want to absorb at the moment, but if you frequently configure your treadles for something like walking treadles and you're designing a new one, just to save you from having to go in and enter that every time, you can load a prior project that you had mapped treadles, and then you can, when you're loading your new one, change that copy Treadle Settings from a no to a yes, and it will copy them over for you. Alright, so let's go ahead with quick load yes and just hit load. And I'll show you what loading looks like. So it's showing a little progress indicator with tie up, weft warp, and color table. This is a fairly big width, and but as you can see, it doesn't take too long once it's done that first time. So now it's loaded. So what I would normally do is just immediately go back into the weave screen that we saw earlier. It remembers that I'm on sequence 309 and I need to press treadle 5. But let's go back and look at some more project setup options. So I've got a brand new project on my loom. I've loaded my width, and now I want to do the threading and the tie up. So let's look at tie up first. What I normally do on tie up is I actually take the system unit off the castle and lay it on the floor beside me as I crawl up under the loom. And I look, because to me this is easier to see that treadle 1 needs to be at 2, 3, 4, 8, and 12 than it is to read a draft or print a draft or something that's beside me. So I go through and do each tie up, and then when I sit back down at my bench, I always press the treadles and double check before I start to weave. So you just use the arrow keys to up or down to scroll through the treadle numbers. Going back into project setup and thread assist. Alright, so what we're looking at here, and I'm going to go, this is one where I had been playing with it before, and I'm going to show you a few things. So when you start out, it would really start out at thread 1. Right now we're at thread 251, and notice if I do my arrows I can go back anywhere I want to go. And if I hit this X in the middle, I can go to the middle of the threading. So as you're threading along, most people do right to left, and notice this hand here by default will be in that direction. So as you're threading, what you would typically do is here, this says I'm on thread 187. This remembers your progress just like with weaving. So we often don't get all our threading done in one sitting. Sometimes it can take days. So I'm at thread number 187, needs to go in shaft 2. The next one shaft 3, shaft 4, shaft 1, 2, 3, 4, 9. So this, and I'm using thread groups of 8. So what I would do is I sit down to the loom is I would pull over those heddles for 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9. I would thread them, and then I would press anywhere in the middle of the screen, not on the arrows, but just anywhere on the screen. Now I would do thread 10, 11, 12, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 9 the same way. Now if I didn't want to thread in groups of 8, and maybe because of the pattern it was more logical for me to thread in, say, groups of 6. Sometimes it's a little hard to key in the right place on the screen. Now I'm in groups of 6. Again, once I thread these, just do that. Now did you see a little red flash? I'm going to go back to the prior ones. See these red, hopefully you can see it on the video, but once you have marked something as threaded by pressing in the middle of the screen, red lines appear in between those threads to show you have threaded them. Also, when you come back and turn on TempoTreadle, it will remember and go back into thread assist. It remembers where you left off, and you can tell if you've already threaded a section by the red lines in between the threads. So a couple other features about this. We talked about the direction right now is going from right to left. So 201 to warp thread 206, warp thread 207 to 212. If you want to thread the other direction from left to right, you can do so. Also, if you want to thread center out, you can do so. So I can use this little X, it will take me to the center of my warp. The center thread was 275, and it has a special little X in it showing that it's the center thread. And so I can go from the center back right if the direction's in this one, and then once I go all the way back to the beginning, I can go back to the center, then change my direction and go the other way. So that's just a little feature for those of you who, there are not too many people that like to do that, but with some looms you just hate moving those shafts across that little center clip. So you can certainly use the center out method of threading if you want to, and this will make it easier than it would be if you were threading by paper. Unfortunately, it doesn't know if you put the thread in the right heddle, but it certainly helps you for making threading errors. Also, I find it very useful when I have multicolor warps. It's very reassuring that the warp end that's coming off my cross is the one that's showing on the screen, because I know if it doesn't, I possibly made a winding error or something. And I sometimes wind with this screen if I have a lot of color changes. I'll sometimes use a thread assist to help me with my winding. Okay, let's go back to, hit the home key, I'll go back to project setup, and let's see what else we've not covered here. So we covered loom action, tie up, thread assist, load width. Let's go into treadle ray. Now, treadle settings, let's see. Position 1, if you can see here up on the left, says that it's mapped to treadle blank. And you also see the status is off. So what that tells me is the first treadle on my loom, physically the first treadle on the left, is off. And I don't have it tied up. And the reason I need to turn that off is if it's sitting down on the sensors, it would be sensing constantly and you couldn't weave a TempoTreadle. So that's how you can tell the system to ignore something that's not tied up. Position 2, notice I hit the green arrow to advance down or up through the treadle settings. The second treadle from the left, I'm calling treadle 1. See this treadle map? It's treadle 1. There are arrows on the side of this treadle map, so I can map that second position to any treadle number I want, and as long as that treadle number is in my width, that's what it's going to expect. The line at the bottom, the thing at the bottom says color alert on. Now sometimes you might want to turn that off. A color alert on TempoTreadle has a special little tone that gets your attention when it's time to use a different color as you're throwing your weft picks. So if you have, sometimes like if you have a tabby thread, you may not want color alerts on those treadles because you only want it on the pattern treadles, and you want it to ignore those tabby treadles for purposes of alerting you to color changes. So that's an example of when you might want to turn the color alert off on certain treadles and not on others. So you can remap your treadles. You don't have to. If you don't do any treadle mapping, it'll just assume they're numbered from left to right, starting with 1. I'm going to hit the home key. Go into project setup. There is one other feature we didn't see on project setup screen, and that is colors used. And this is a very simple color pattern on this one, just one, it's just a 2-color width. But if you have a lot of colors in your design, you may want to check this screen when you first get started, because if you have a lot of analogous colors, they may be hard to tell apart on the TempoTreadle system unit. So I have occasionally, when I was using a lot of colors that were pretty close, gone back and made them a little more contrasting in my design file, so that I could be sure when it called for a weft pick, I knew which one it was wanted me to throw. Okay, so I'm going to hit the home screen. We've gone through everything on project setup. Now let's look at project progress. So as I mentioned, this is a real project that I do have in progress. So let's go look at my length screen and see what I've woven. So this tells me my PPI up at the top is 22.17, and it tells me that I've woven, according to pick counter 1, 982 picks, 44.3 inches, and that's 1 yard, 8.3 inches. If I had zeroed out another pick counter, say pick counter 2, I could have had it measuring a different length, like maybe you want to use that for a border or something like that. There's also something called interval pick, which I won't cover here, but I'll tell you briefly what it does. You can set up an interval and you can tell me, say, I want at pick 1100, I want you to sound an alarm. So I say alarm, it's just a very special tone that gets your attention, a kind of a high-pitched tone. And I often do that when I'm weaving something where I want to be alerted when I've woven to the correct length, like a scarf or a towel or a table mat or something like that. So I just don't keep weaving along and weave it too long. So that's a good thing to do. But what I do want to show you is how do you set the picks per inch. Now one thing is you can put in the picks per inch. If I just click PPI here, I can set it manually, and I can go in there and set it to theoretically what I hope to get if I want to, what I think I'm doing. But I got tired of having to get out a calculator and figuring out what my picks per inch was. So we have a feature in here that I use very often that's set from length and pick 1. You can also do it from pick 2 if you needed to for some reason. But this is usually what I do. So when I've started a new warp and I've gotten my beat kind of adjusted, got through my test picks, after I've woven 6 or 8 inches or so, I'm going to get out the tape measure just one time and I'm going to take a measurement. And then what I'm going to do is, well, sorry, I hit the wrong thing here, so I'm going to go back to length. So I'm going to set it from pick 1 and I'm going to say I have woven, I'm going to put 44.3 inches, which just because this is a real project, and that really is what I've woven. But normally I would have put in like 6 or 8 inches. And it's going to calculate just by simple math that I've done. My real PPI is 22.17. I'll show you that again since I kind of breezed through it. So if I do PPI here and I say set from length and pick 1, let's say I put in 30 inches, which is not right, but if I had if my cloth was really 30 inches, I would have had a picks per inch of 32.73. Now, since this is a real project, I am going to fix that. So I'm going to put back in my real measurement. So what's nice about this is you can always tell what you've woven. I no longer use as long as your beat's consistent. If your beat's not consistent, it may not be accurate, but I find this to be very helpful not to use a tape or anything to keep measuring how much I've woven. Okay, so that's woven length. I'm going back into project progress. I'll show you the counter screen. The counter screen, it allows you to reset your sequence if you needed to, reset your pick counters, and you can set up your interval and interval limit. And you might ask, what's the difference in interval and interval limit? Normally you say you wanted to weave 1,000 picks in each towel, you'd set your interval limit at 1,000. The interval would normally start at 0, but if you forgot to set it and your pick counter 1 told you were 50 picks into it, you might set that interval counter at 50 so it starts counting from there. So that's a very quick description of the counter screen. So I'll go back into project progress. Now there is another one that I do use fairly frequently called reset progress, and I'm not going to really reset it because this is a real project, but there's a counters and timers, and if you hit the yellow button that says reset, it will zero out all the counters for you. And that's convenient if you're doing multiple towels, say on a warp or something like that, to reset everything to 0. That way if you were doing a number of towels, you had your interval limits set up, you'd zero all those pick counters and interval counters so that the interval will just reset and let you weave your other 1,000 picks or whatever it is. so it's a time saver. So if you're still tracking on, I know it's a lot to absorb, but most of the time the only thing you're doing is in this weave screen. That's where you live. Some of these other things you may never use, but it's nice to know they're there if you want to. There is one screen we didn't look at, and that's, well, actually there's two. There's System Settings. Hardly ever use this after your initial tune array, and this is where when you get your TempoTreadle for your loom, you go in and do the tune array there. We have some other videos on that, so I'm not going to go through that right now. But Autoload I usually leave on. Whoops, I pushed the wrong thing. Autoload I usually leave on, and it will show you your current width. If I went and loaded another one, it just becomes the current width. So what that means is when I power up TempoTreadle, it will automatically load that width for me, so I don't have to go to Project Setup and load width. So I hardly ever turn that off. And in System Settings, there's a few things you can do with sounds to change your aerotone if you find it too obnoxious. You can reset your volume here. And the unit screen allows you to select metric if you're like to work in metric instead of imperial. And that's about all there is to the setup. The other thing on here that we didn't look at is system info. And you do have the capability to load a new software release when we put some new features in, or if there are any bugs or anything that get corrected, so you can tell what version of the firmware you're on with this screen. That's all that does. So that is a run through of just about all of the features that are in the TempoTreadle interface.